Some fans view FBI director Gordon Cole as basically a stand-in for film director David Lynch within the fictional narrative of The Return. I find this view pretty convincing. And this isn't just because Lynch plays Gordon. There is one scene in particular that leads me to this conclusion. Gordon Cole has a vision of Laura crying. This may seem pretty random and inexplicable at first. Unless I missed some Twin Peaks lore, Gordon has no personal connection to Laura other than overseeing Cooper's investigation of her murder. I don't think they shared an intuitive connection like Cooper and Laura did. Looking at this scene from the viewpoint that Laura's image represents the world soul just makes a lot of sense to me. In The Return, we see that the world of Twin Peaks has become nastier, sickly, violent, and generally unpleasant since Dale Cooper's disappearance. The original series always swayed between the warm and fuzzy, small-town, cherry pie vibes and the occult, dark shadow elements. But in The Return, it seems to me that the shadow elements have almost totally overrun the world of Twin Peaks. The Return is full of graphic depictions of illness, drug abuse, criminality, violence, and murder. Beloved original characters, as well as new ones, are in dire straits, many dealing with illness and death. The Log Lady's final scene is incredibly poignant. Catherine Coulson's true-to-life performance of a woman at the very end of her life speaks to the death of the nostalgic, warm world so many fans came to love. This nostalgic, warm, fuzzy feeling was a world full of soul, full of love, despite the creeping darkness at the edges. When Margaret says, "I'm dying," it seems to me that she speaks for herself as well as in her capacity as an oracle for the world soul. Her log being her connection to the world of nature and the underworld, where her late husband now resides. In The Return, Dr. Jacoby, who is apparently a Jungian according to Mark Frost, goes on several rants about the state of society and the world. The interlude scenes at the Roadhouse featuring random townspeople and visitors show us how disturbed the world of Twin Peaks has become. I believe this scene of Gordon having a vision of Laura in anguish is a meta-commentary. This is David Lynch himself looking directly at the despair of the Anima Mundi. She suffers greatly due to humanity's collective ignorance. The world soul is actively being degraded and abused. Cooper once said that everyone in the town of Twin Peaks felt the horrific murder of Laura Palmer in some way. The slaying of Laura Palmer was a turning point, the most cruel sign that soul sickness was on the rise. The delicate balance Sheriff Truman and his Bookhouse boys tried to maintain was now lost. The way I see it, Laura's plight and that of the world soul are inextricably tied. In a recent book, author Peter Kingsley uses unsettling language when describing how the divine feminine has been violated and denigrated by our culture. This controversial language applies to the horrors that Laura Palmer suffered. If the world is a dream that we all live in, it is increasingly becoming a nightmare. It's as if there's an ever-advancing plague dismantling the fabric of our humanity and our society. In indigenous cultures around the world, you have medicine people who apparently have deep connections to the world of spirit, the underworld, and the world of soul. Sometimes they're called shamans. Many shamans attempt to heal illness by addressing what is often called soul loss. These are situations where a person loses their connection to soul. Their soul becomes lost and falls into the hands of spirits. The Log Lady in an introduction tells us sometimes we see the eyes, those horrible times when we see the eyes that have no soul. Then we know a darkness. The Return shows us the first nuclear explosion that took place in July 1945. A new era has begun, an era where human beings can manipulate the creative powers of the world in ways unheard of before. This is the ultimate degradation of the world soul. The act of detonating that bomb rips a hole into existence, and the soul sickness enters the world and begins to spread rapidly. Mark Frost has written that Dr. Jacoby is describing the Kali Yuga, a term in some Hindu traditions. The Kali Yuga is the age where the demon Kali reigns supreme. To be clear, this isn't the goddess Kali, we'll talk about her later, but rather this is a demon called Kali. This is an age of vice, darkness, misery. I view the Kali Yuga as an age of soul loss. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. Thus, the soul has gradually been turned into a Nazareth from which nothing good can come. And this has resulted in neurosis and similar illnesses, the loss of meaning in life, mental epidemics, and the restriction of consciousness, which leads to emptiness in life." Jung warns us that our denigration of the soul has left us alone and confronted with all the demons of hell, which are showing up as anxiety, neurosis, nocturnal fears, and compulsions. Even spirituality becomes ruthless, arrogant, tyrannical. Von Franz warned in her book The Cat that the whole collective unconscious is in an upheaval. There is disharmony in the conscious behavior of the collective, and the unconscious is brooding on destruction. This is our situation now. Gordon Cole tells his team that there is an entity loose in the world, an extreme negative force, an ancient demon called Judy. This scene felt like an awkward exposition dump to me. It seems that this Judy, or Jaude, wasn't actually really an ancient demon in real life. It's a fictional creation by Lynch and Frost. And quick aside, for some reason I can't shake the idea that Lynch used the name Judy as an allusion to the centuries-old tradition of Punch and Judy puppet shows, where cartoonish violence and even torture were used as a form of public amusement, and perhaps as an homage to a fellow surrealist who made a film called Punch and Judy. I get the sense that Frost and Lynch retroactively reworked the concept of Judy for the return. The entities that feast on pain and suffering were always representatives of the shadows hidden within the soul of Twin Peaks. And now Judy joins them as the larger-scale demonic figure representing the state of the world's soul. Some speculators think that this apparently female entity, which spews forth a stream of bile and evil into manifestation, is the Judy which Gordon was referring to. I agree with this, but only to an extent. I think Judy is the world soul turned sour. The feminine divine principle has been denigrated to the point where it's no longer recognizable. The living engine of the manifested world has been corroded into a monstrosity of wrathful miscreation. I think this approach is given further credence by the depiction of Laura Palmer's mother, Sarah. A scene from her childhood plays out in the same episode as the nuclear explosion. A foul creature was produced and it enters Sarah's window late at night. This echoes how the evil entity Bob supposedly came through Laura's window late at night. The young and innocent Sarah falls asleep and this gross creature crawls into her mouth. Later in life, Sarah is portrayed as a woman possessed by trauma and pain to the point of becoming demonic herself. This is not shocking since she's been drinking the foul waters of miscreation since that evening in 1945. We see this possessed Sarah murder a man and destroy Laura's picture, the picture, an act indicating the full-on assault on the innocence and purity of the world soul. I think another representation of the same dynamic, Cooper's run-ins with American Girl and Naido. They seem to be held hostage in a kind of hellscape prison. I see this as the innocence and purity of the divine feminine being locked away by an unseen, malicious force. This brings to mind a quote from Peter Kingsley. "Out of the sheerest, stupid greed, we snatched away the gifts so freely given by the divine goddess, who holds the whole world on her lap, and locked her up alone in a tiny room." This is the situation we are in. The feminine principle has been degraded, assaulted, and locked away, and thus the manifested world is sick, and society is in ruins. Jung mentioned how loss of the anima means a diminution of vitality, of flexibility, and of human kindness. The spread of soul loss, this invading spirit, can be observed today as psychological phenomenon in the everyday lives of the human beings around us. So the question arises, how can the feminine be redeemed? Towards the end of the return, our beloved Dale Cooper is seemingly no longer in battle with his shadow self. I believe Cooper succeeded in becoming a fire-walking magician. the magician in the cryptic "Fire Walk With Me" incantation. Cooper then embarks on a plan which I found to be genuinely shocking. Cooper firewalks, transcending space and time. He enters the past and changes the course of history. He saves Laura Palmer from her murder and then attempts to escort her to safety. Cooper tells her they're going home. But the plan does not go as he expected. She disappears into thin air. In the final episode of The Return, we see Cooper attempt another rescue, and it results in the memorable, unsettling final scene. Now, regardless of one's interpretation of what happens at the end of The Return, it is certainly not a happy ending. Our last glimpse of Cooper is that of a man who is lost in time, confused, and unsettled. Some fans believe that Cooper's consciousness never fully left the Red Room as he entered it at the end of Season 2. And it seems an aspect of Cooper has become trapped in something like what Tibetan Buddhist traditions call a bardo, an intermediate, transitional, or liminal state between death and rebirth. It seems like an easy conclusion, and I subscribe to this idea as well, in a way. It certainly brings to mind the idea of the eternal return, explored by some ancient Greek thinkers and the philosopher Nietzsche. I think there's a general assumption that Cooper may be able to escape this bardo if he executes his rescue plan better on the next go-around, sort of like Bill Murray's character in Groundhog's Day. Cooper must properly rescue Laura Palmer from the clutches of the evil entity Judy, and he'll be free. I see things a bit differently. I suspect that Cooper's attempt to save Laura from her tragic fate is precisely what makes him a man lost to time and space. Basically, he became the next Philip Jeffries. Considering how non-linear some of The Return is, this is all open to interpretation, of course. But it seems to me that Cooper made the decision to rescue Laura only after he had dealt with his shadow, and his actions from this moment on rip Red Room Laura out of the underworld and put him and the entire world at risk. At the end of The Return, he's very far away from understanding this. Cooper thinks he has the answer. He will set things right. To Cooper, Laura Palmer represents all the women he has put into harm's way. So by saving her, Cooper believes he is doing the right thing. He gets to save his soul and bring the world back to rights. Once he's done, maybe he can finally settle down, have some coffee and pie, maybe finally buy some property. But I think Cooper makes a terrible miscalculation here. Von Franz writes about the sort of approach Cooper is taking. The masculine's, Yang's, natural temperament says, I must do something about it. I must break out of this situation. I'll fight. And she describes the dangers involved in Cooper's mission within a chapter literally titled The Return. If one does not constantly walk forward, the past sucks one back. You have constantly to carry the torch of the new light forward. As soon as you begin to look backward, it has you again. The past is a tremendous power. In certain situations, one has to make a cut with the past and say, it's finished, it's done. One has to leave the past to itself. Cooper did the opposite of this. He intervened in the past. Cooper literally and figuratively looks backwards. After Laura's disappearance in the woods, Cooper finds himself in the Red Room. He enters a state of confusion here. When we see Red Room Laura again, we watch an abbreviated version of the Red Room encounter we saw back in episode 1 of The Return. Cooper seems to be in a loop. I believe this is a loop of his own making. Laura is ripped from the Red Room, from the underworld, screaming in agony to somewhere above. I think Cooper misunderstood something critically important about Red Room Laura. This is not Laura, the little girl who lives down the lane. This is Laura transformed. Laura no longer needs saving in the flesh. We all saw her transformation at the end of Fire Walk With Me. The soul of a tormented high school student, Laura Palmer, was redeemed after her physical death, and Cooper was there comforting her. But now Cooper doesn't quite recognize who she is anymore. He's been in limbo for a long time. Laura tells Cooper, "I am dead, but I live," and shows him that she's a being of light. This brought to my mind something the Anima told Jung: "My light is not of this world." Red Room Laura is now explicitly the divine feminine, the Anima Mundi. She is a being of light. She doesn't need redemption in the flesh. The redemption of the feminine means not the redemption of the flesh. It means the redemption of the divinity of the flesh, the divine archetypal godlike aspect of the flesh, and the implications of that are very difficult and complicated. Now, this is a tough pill to swallow. Of course, Cooper wants to save Laura. That's his job. He views himself as a Jungian animus figure, a yang, active, masculine force. Cooper was attempting to accomplish the goal of various Gnostic and esoteric alchemical practitioners. The idea was to free the soul from her entanglement in, or identity with, the world, liberating something divine from the darkness of the material world. By the way, I think this was also probably the intention or inspiration behind Josie getting trapped in wood back in season 2. While the execution was clearly botched without Lynch's direct involvement, I read somewhere that this scene had been conceived of much earlier in the production of the show. Cooper was wrong. Laura Palmer's redemption and salvation already happened, and it wasn't through any active masculine rescue. Her salvation came from a release into a very on-the-nose representation of the divine feminine. While her murder was a tragedy to the world of Twin Peaks, her physical death actually resulted in a divine transformation. Her murder was not the end of Laura Palmer, but a spiritual resurrection into the underworld mysteries of the divine feminine. The way I see it, when Cooper rips the transformed Laura violently out of the underworld, the manifested physical world fell deep into disarray and disharmony. Kingsley refers to Cooper's approach as the brutal violence of optimism. He writes, "Try with your best ideas to make it better, and you destroy its fabric, tear it to pieces, rip it apart. All of our finest ideas about what to do are nothing but the politest excuses for hiding further and further away from the violation of the sacred." And it's definitely my impression that Cooper violated the sacred by using his ability to alter the past, no matter how well-intentioned his actions were. I think the consequences of Cooper's actions were far-reaching and devastating. Instead of redeeming the feminine principle, Cooper is drained of the feminine principle himself. This is the Cooper we see in the final episode of The Return. It seems his name is no longer Cooper, it's Richard. He is distinct from the Coopers we have seen before. This Cooper has been drained of the feminine principle and is solely focused on his mission. While his intention seems noble, he's cold, violent, points his gun at innocence, and tragically, he expresses no love for coffee or pie. In the final episode of The Return, Diane takes up the mantle of playing a cliché, Lynchian anima figure. She's got her bright red wig, alternating Taoist-inspired black and white fingernails. Diane is not quite the expansive Anima Mundi exactly, but she's more like Cooper's personal anima in this situation. She plays the role of a female presence that serves as a counterpoint to his coldness. And I think it's not a coincidence that she was violated in much the same way Laura was. Diane questions the mission Cooper is on. She offers him an opportunity to change his mind, but he won't. This is the Yang principle overtaking Cooper, the driving masculine principle at work, and he literally drives most of the episode. Diane, as the personal anima in this sequence, abandons him. In pursuit of redeeming soul, Cooper has lost his soul, and he doesn't seem to realize what's happened. His intuition, again a key characteristic of the feminine principle, is gone. Cooper thinks he found Laura Palmer, but she calls herself Carrie Page. She's not exactly a divine being of light. Actually, Carrie Page seems pretty drained of soul herself. She doesn't remember her former life in the warm and fuzzy world of Twin Peaks, and she has found herself embroiled in a violent plot of some kind. Cooper drives Laura to Twin Peaks, but it doesn't seem to be the town we remember. It seems pretty lifeless. After failing to bring Carrie Page to Laura's childhood home, he's at a complete loss. That's when Carrie Page lets out that blood-curdling scream after we faintly hear Sarah yell Laura's name. Cooper is confused in a way I think we've never seen before. And frankly, I found the final episode of The Return more horrifying than most horror movies. I've seen the idea that Carrie Page's scream at the end is some form of salvation, an awakening, a defeat of the demons that have taken control. This interpretation is interesting, and the more I consider it, the more I think I can probably make a decent case for it. But following my own intuition, I keep coming back to a different interpretation. If one looks at these two endings for Laura, which one seems to represent salvation and redemption? And if one looks at these two endings for Cooper, which one seems to represent success? This final image of The Return, likely the final image of the series, is Cooper greatly disturbed by a shocking truth revealed to him by Laura in the Underworld. This image just doesn't scream redemption to me. So I keep returning to a different interpretation of the scream. One that says the scream serves a dual purpose. It's Laura Palmer, the little girl who lives down the lane, as her alter ego, Carrie Page, confronted with the utter horror of the abuse she ran away from. And simultaneously, it is Laura Palmer, in her representative role as the Anima Mundi, expressing utter terror when she reflects on what's become of the world. To me, this moment isn't shock therapy. This isn't redemption. This is pure shock at what we've done to the world soul. I've given this a lot of thought and settled on the idea that it's the very mission Cooper is on that is the problem. It's not that he needs to get the mission right. It's that he's on the mission in the first place. Ultimately, what is Cooper attempting to accomplish? The answer seems to be to rescue, heal, and redeem his soul, and by extension, the world soul. It's what we're all trying to accomplish in one way or another. It's the goal of healing ourselves, our family, community, society, and the living earth as well. In the world of The Return, and in our own very world, the divine feminine has become a shadow figure. The video for the song Shadow by the Chromatics that was featured in episode 1 of The Return hints at this. In the music video for Shadow, we see the vocalist swaying hypnotically. Her look is that of a femme fatale anima figure, and she stands in front of those underworld red curtains. As she looks evocatively into the camera, she sings "Shadow, Take Me Down" and asks us, "Can you hear me?" Laura Palmer experienced horrendous pain and grief as she was pulled into the shadows before her tragic end. She was the canary in the coal mine for the town of Twin Peaks. A young woman who meant so much to so many was pulled into the shadows before many others. The Kali Yuga started early for her, but eventually it overtook the world. And now, as Peter Kingsley puts it, the underworld has come to us. Those who notice first hear a voice of darkness abruptly calling them back to their depths. Even though Cooper thought he had purified himself, defeating Mr. C, he still becomes an unwitting active participant in this dreadful world drained of soul. I've seen commentary where some say Cooper was full of hubris like Odysseus in the Greek epic The Odyssey, or that Cooper flew too close to the sun on this one, like another figure from Greek mythology. Maybe that's the case, but to me, it seems he's more confused than anything. He thinks he's doing the right thing, and he's following what he thinks are divine orders, but his sense of duty and social role gets in the way. To better understand Cooper's error, let's look at how The Return's imagery and themes resonate with esoteric interpretations of ancient Greek, Egyptian, and Eastern wisdom traditions. Like in the Odyssey, otherworldly figures have been working to guide Cooper. As Jungian Barbara Hanna points out, such beings were once called gods. The main source of guidance has been the otherworldly giant, the fireman. Cooper's been guided by this phantom giant ever since the beginning of his time in Twin Peaks. Cooper has had issues understanding him throughout the series, but they're really not aligned in The Return. So who exactly is the fireman anyways? When answering this question, I think the first place to start is to consider where he lives. He and his consort live in a tower, a sort of island castle on the shores of the primordial ocean of consciousness. This is a divine realm, which many fans believe is the White Lodge. From this tower, the fireman is shown to be on alert. He watches the world of humanity from afar. The watchtower contains rows and rows of machinery, apparently producing or harnessing electric power. The decor of the watchtower is old-timey, and our glimpses of it are in black and white, with one exception. What does this tell us? One interpretation is that the events we see here take place in the distant past, perhaps in July 1945. But I think this realm is beyond time and space as we understand it. According to Jeremy Nadler in his books, the ancient Egyptians maintained a connection to a divine realm called the First Time. This was a realm where metaphysical realities lived as mythological symbols. This was the realm of the gods. It existed outside of space and time. The patterns of reality within the First Time would sort of resonate and manifest into day-to-day earthly reality. This First Time shares similarities to Plato's theory of forms, where ideas and metaphysical forms from a divine world act as the non-physical essence of physical things in earthly reality. The world we live in, the world of physical manifestation, is like a projection of the First Time. And in the fireman's tower, we literally see the earth being projected. The revered Hindu guru Ramana Maharshi often used the analogy of our reality being projected like an image on a movie screen. It's quite likely Lynch is aware of this, considering his advocacy for Eastern contemplative knowledge and practices. The fireman's watchtower is just above the primordial ocean of consciousness. The ancient Egyptians called this Nun. The First Time can be understood as the first expression of the primordial ocean of consciousness. The fireman lives in the First Time, the source of the gods. Seems to me the fireman is a god figure. Now, I don't mean the fireman is a direct substitute for the Judeo-Christian conception of an old man who lives in the sky, although maybe in a way I actually am saying that. But regardless, I'm using the word God in the sense that Jung used it. Often, Jung would use the word God if he felt it would help the person he was working with understand the transcendent divine power of something he called the self. The Jungian self is both the center and circumference of the conscious and the unconscious. It is a totality. As an archetypal symbol, it is a God image, therefore universal and eternal. Jung tried to prove in his life's work that behind the animus and anima, a still mightier content dwells hidden, the true atomic nucleus of the psyche, which he called the self. The term the self is used in many different philosophical, psychological, and religious traditions, so it can be confusing when we hear the term. Sometimes you might find that the term the self means one's individuality as a persona, personality, or ego. While the things on this slide are very well and nice, this is not really what I'm referring to here. In Jungian psychology, the self is more expansive than that. Jung's use of the term was probably closer to that of Ramana Maharshi. The self includes consciousness, the unconscious, and the ego persona. The self is both the whole circle and the center dot. Jung described a healing process that may occur as we discover the self. He called it individuation. In individuation, one comes to terms with the totality of the self. A key part of this process is to engage with one's unconscious mind. Individuation is not exactly individuality as we normally use the term in everyday language. A misunderstanding of individuation and of the self often leads to inaccurate representations of the meaning of Jung's work. our existence as separate beings, our former ego nature, is abolished. The circle of consciousness is widened. The sources of conflict are dried up. Many have encountered the self as a primordial man in dreams, visions, religious mythology, fairy tales, and the arts. The self is often portrayed in various ways. One form of representing the self is called the anthropos. Von Franz explains the anthropos is the great inner man. In Jewish legend, Adam Kadam, the first man, and the Jewish version of the anthropos, is often described as a cosmic giant. The anthropos is the primordial man from whom all draw their life. Barbara Hanna recounts in her book Encounters in the Soul that Jung used to say the self was both individual and even unique, also at the same time universal. The self was the central presiding figure of the collective unconscious. Human beings have to do our best to let the self unfold its individual and unique pattern that is our destiny to live. But we must also know we can never fully comprehend it. It's very likely that Mark Frost understood the fireman to be a representation of the self, a divine god in the form of an anthropos giant. Like a dream, the return melds various images traditionally used to represent the self into its representation of the fireman. The first is that of Zeus, the chief deity of the ancient Greek religion. In the return, we see how the fireman birthed the golden Laura orb, recalling how Zeus creates Athena, goddess of wisdom. According to Kingsley, philosopher Empedocles referred to Zeus as the element of our own immortality and pure divinity, the very substance of our soul. If Laura is the world soul, the fireman is what generates her very substance. The mysterious Pythagorean pre-Socratic thinkers were esoteric cultists who described something called the central fire. It was hypothesized to be positioned at the center of the universe. The central fire was referred to by different names: Watchtower of Zeus, or Hearth Altar of the universe. Its comparison to a hearth, the religious center of the house and the state, shows its proper role as the palace where Zeus guarded his sacred fire in the center of the cosmos. Zeus was often portrayed as wielding a lightning bolt. In the return, we see the fireman giant harnessing powerful electric currents with the machinery in the watchtower. The philosopher Heraclitus was quoted as saying, "This world, as with all things, was neither made by man nor by God, has always been, and is, and will be, an eternal living fire." This is why the giant is the fireman. He harnesses the very power of creation, the world fire. The alchemist and Gnostic Zosimos of Panopolis also had the conception of a great light man who lives in paradise. Another Gnostic had the idea of the Autopator, the original being, who contains the cosmos within himself. And he lives with his consort, a female power that stems from his source and is intimately connected with him. Another way to understand the fireman is by looking at some traditions within Hinduism. The fireman's creation of the Laura orb is quite similar to how the god Vishnu manifests. They're often portrayed as bubbles or orbs. It also brings to mind the god Shiva, who is often portrayed as lying flat while acting through the goddess, his divine feminine energy. In several forms of Hindu belief, God takes action only through his dynamic energy, which is often personified as his spouse, goddess. While her role is different depending on the tradition, she's often considered a central figure as the dynamic aspect of God. And she is often represented as a queen of a celestial universal court. The fireman's consort is the divine feminine residing in the first time in a royal fashion reminiscent of a queen. Her name is Senorita Dido. Dido was the name of a legendary wise queen in ancient Greece. It is she, not the fireman, who who blesses the Laura orb with a kiss and sends her to the manifest world as soul. The fire mentioned in the Fire Walk With Me incantation is the very force that allows reality to be manipulated through spiritual heat. I'll read from this informative article in Asia Society. Shakti means power. In Hindu philosophy and theology, Shakti is understood to be the active dimension of the Godhead, the divine power that underlies the Godhead's ability to create the world and display itself. It is quite common, furthermore, to identify Shakti with a female being, a goddess. It is identified as female energy because Shakti is responsible for creation, as mothers are responsible for birth. Without Shakti, nothing in this universe would happen. Without Shakti, the god is often portrayed as a corpse. Shakti can be understood or at least related to what the Chinese refer to as Qi, or some forms of Hinduism call Kundalini. Raising the potency and the flow of this energy within the human body allows one to enter altered states of being, and many claim this allows for the manipulation of space, time, and matter. So the way I see it, the concept of firewalking is inherently and intrinsically tied to the divine feminine principle. In the center here is a representation of the Hindu god Shiva doing a cosmic dance, generating world fire. The reason the giant is called the fireman is not because he puts out fires, but because he generates Shakti, the central fire. The return makes explicit allusions to the magical power of electricity, which I view as a representation of Shakti at work. Now, one could say this is inconsistent. Is the feminine principle water? Is it fire? Is it electricity? Well, like many ancient occult traditions, the return liberally mixes metaphor, allegory, and representative imagery to describe esoteric ideas. You can sort of think of Shakti as similar to the electromagnetic spectrum. Visible light, electricity, magnetism are all modes of one energy, and we describe them as behaving like water waves, and it can light up like a fire. These electromagnetic forces play an important role in structuring matter. This again recalls Heraclitus, who had this idea of the entire spectrum being world fire. In his book, Ancient Philosophy, Mystery and Magic, Kingsley describes the activities of certain Greek cults that worshipped at volcanoes. Kingsley makes a convincing case that pre-Socratic philosophers like Parmenides and Empedocles were much more like shaman magicians who believed that they were channeling magic from the underworld and its fires. The idea of world fire, an archetypal idea, goes back to the primitive idea of a magic potency that was thought to be both an objective force in the outer world and a subjective state of intensity in the inner world of the subject. The pre-Socratic ancient Greek cultists likely had shamanistic practices, which supposedly allow a practitioner to alter consciousness in a way that space and time are transcended. While there is some evidence available confirming these pre-Socratics used magical incantations and magical items such as rings, there is definitely hard evidence that later occult practitioners in the Greco-Roman Egyptian world practiced magic with magical items. Several Eastern religious traditions make mention of esoteric practices, such as those found in Tantrism, that are meant to allow a practitioner first-hand experience and use of the divine feminine creative energy of Shakti, with or without the use of magical items. To me, this is what firewalking is. And in The Return, Cooper explicitly uses electricity to firewalk, traveling through realms. The room where American Girl and Naito are trapped have a blazing red world fire. This is an alternative representation of the hearth altar, the central fire. In this location, one finds electric conduits for firewalking. Throughout all of Twin Peaks and some of Lynch's other work, we see flashing lights every time Shakti is buzzing in high quantities. One of the most interesting things I've experienced after years of sitting practice is the flashing of inner lights, And it's very similar to the effect that Lynch likes to use. For years now, as I sit with my eyes closed, I begin to see flashing lights after about 13 to 15 minutes of quiet sitting practice. They look like electrical impulses. Sometimes they've pulsated so brightly that I've opened my eyes thinking that someone is turning the lights off and on in the room that I'm in. And this is apparently quite common for those who meditate routinely. I assume that Lynch, as an experienced meditator, knows full well what he's doing when he uses this motif in his work. The fireman has always been a divine voice for Cooper. In the original series, he operated as what the ancient Greeks would call a sort of daimon, a guiding spirit. In the return, the giant is expanded to be an even more explicit representation of the self. As von Franz noted, the self is often experienced by human beings as a divine bidding. The anthropos can be experienced as a deep inner divine voice, guiding or even commanding the experiencer. In the return, we see the fireman play this role pretty explicitly. But Cooper doesn't understand what he's talking about, despite saying he does. The fireman tells Cooper, "It is in our house now." And he asks Cooper to listen to the sounds coming from the phonograph. There has been a lot of conjecture about what these cryptic statements mean. Looking at the return as being about the degradation of the Anima Mundi, the world soul, provides a pretty decent interpretation. A house is a symbol rich with meaning. It is often an important image appearing in dreams and human narratives. A typical Jungian reading of a house image in a dream is that it serves as a representation of the totality of one's psyche, one's heart or soul. Home is where the heart is. There are scenes in which Laura's house has what seems to be a heart decoration on the front door. Cooper is attempting to bring Laura home. He's trying to bring soul back to the heart space. But the fireman seems to be saying this plague of soul sickness has entered the home, the heart space. The situation is dire. At the end of the return, we see this again as the Tremens and the Chalfants, shadowy figures associated with Laura Palmer's darkness and despair, are revealed to have been residing in the Palmer residence. When Cooper and the firemen meet in the White Lodge, the giant's consort is nowhere to be seen. Señorita Dido was listening to music on the phonograph the first time we saw her. This music could be the very music which the small man referred to previously, but now there is no music. Instead, the fireman brings odd, unsettling sounds to our attention. I think what we hear now is the noise created by the soul sickness. This sound is heard again just as Laura disappears in the woods, right before her screams are heard. I might as well mention two other common representations of the self before we move on. Owls play an important role in Twin Peaks. Major Briggs, who becomes an ally of the fireman, tells Cooper a message he'd intercepted from the cosmos, most certainly from the fireman. The owls are not what they seem. And this is true. The self is often represented by owls, and owl imagery has been closely tied with divine feminine figures and goddess worship in ancient times. One example is the Greek goddess Athena, who was birthed from the forehead of Zeus. An owl is seen just as Major Briggs disappears in the woods. In UFO circles, owl sightings are often given prominence as having something to do with alien abductions. I think the UFO references in Twin Peaks are a red herring. Jung wrote about the UFO experience as an encounter with the self. It's probably more helpful to view UFO and abduction experiences as adventures in the unconscious realm. I think Major Briggs' continued presence in the White Lodge, the first time, is more a divine revelation and collaboration than an X-Files type alien encounter. The self can be encountered as mandalas. Mandala means circle in Sanskrit. The mandala is a circle that is often squared and/or contains 4 quadrants. It has a center point or center circle. It can be found in a multitude of cultural contexts all throughout history. Tibetan Buddhists often will use intricate mandalas as practical aids during certain kinds of meditation. Looking at the image helps the practitioner enter altered states of consciousness. While I don't recall any significant mandala imagery in Twin Peaks, I did notice that the glass box seems to mimic the way certain Tibetan mandalas have a sort of Russian doll nested square phenomenon. When the young man gets distracted from looking at this box continuously, as one would do with a Tibetan mandala, he failed to notice the appearance of Cooper, and then of the wrathful entity that attacks him and his partner. Several characters have transformative divine experiences during the series. While Cooper has interacted with what one could describe as gods, it seems he hasn't had a spiritual conversion of any sort. Even though he has ample opportunity and is very open-minded and open-hearted, it seems to me that he fails to make a meaningful connection with the divine realm. Symbols of the self, like the anthropos, owls, or mandalas, pop up in one's life when a personal encounter with and individual relationship to the divine has become a necessity. But coming into contact with such divine representations doesn't mean you'll immediately get into proper relationship with it. I believe Cooper's failure to connect with the self leads him to misuse his ability to harness the world fire, the electricity, the Shakti generated by the firemen. Cooper remains far away, still grasping on to his mission as the hero figure. And this mission resonates with mysterious ancient Greek religious systems of belief, particularly pre-Socratic, pre-Platonic philosophy steeped in magic. Orphism is the name given to a set of religious beliefs and practices originating in the ancient Greek Hellenistic world. Orphism was closely associated with literature ascribed to the mythical poet Orpheus, a hero figure who descended into the Greek underworld and returned. This type of journey serves as the basis of several ancient mystery cults. Orpheus entered the underworld, the world of the dead, in order to rescue the love of his life, Eurydice. He was allowed by divine forces to leave with her, but he would need to exit the underworld without looking back to check if she was still there. The moment he did look back, she disappeared into the underworld. An almost immediate consequence of Cooper's heroics is that Laura disappears from his grasp, and he looks back in disappointment. I think what Cooper failed to realize when attempting to rescue her is that she is not Eurydice. She's not simply a mortal maiden who died too soon. Laura had been transformed into a goddess, a queen of the dead. She now belongs to the underworld as a being of light who lives within the darkness. Red Room Laura can be understood as a representation of the Greek goddess Persephone, a hidden underworld goddess, a divine feminine entity. Persephone was known to greet and initiate visitors with an outstretched right hand. Several important mystery religion traditions, including the Orphics, were closely associated with the goddess Persephone, queen of the underworld, and her mother, goddess Demeter. Kingsley writes, in southern Italy, there were groups of men and women. Sometimes they were referred to as Pythagoreans. Sometimes they preferred presenting themselves as followers of the prophet and magical enchanter Orpheus, who were closely linked with Parmenides. Just like him, they were familiar with the goddess, and they said it was possible to meet her along with other divine beings in the world of the dead. In fact, some argue that the worship cults of Demeter and Persephone played a critically important role in the foundation of what many call Western tradition. Elites from Greek and Roman culture experienced the intense divine power of this mythology firsthand each year at the Temple of Eleusis, outside of Athens. I had the privilege of visiting what's left of Eleusis last year. Many took part in mysterious, life-changing rituals, going into altered states of consciousness, and learning wisdom from their underworld experiences, which apparently had a lasting impact on people from many walks of life, including those who shaped world culture, like Plato. While there are several variations of this mythology, the basic idea is that Persephone was abducted into the underworld without her consent by Hades, a divine underworld force. Demeter mourns the loss of her daughter in agonizing despair. She becomes wrathful, and her wrath exacts a heavy toll on the world. The earth becomes barren and infertile. A lot of people suffered. Eventually, an agreement is struck where Persephone can spend part of the year in the underworld as Queen of the Dead and the other half in the upper world. While on one level this is supposedly just a pre-scientific explanation for the seasons, Persephone's mythology is no mere simplistic tale. She died, yet she lives. There's a reason why Persephone wasn't able to simply leave the underworld. This is because she now belongs there. And eventually Persephone took on her new role and responsibilities as Queen of the Underworld very seriously. The source of light is at home in darkness. This hidden underworld goddess melts and transforms into different representations. Persephone was known by different names. Sometimes goddesses Persephone and Demeter were fused and worshipped together, as well as other figures like the dark witch goddess Hecate. A catabasis experience was a conscious descent into the underworld, a location where every direction is available and everything merges with its opposite. It's the world of death, where night and day both come from. Cooper's entry into the Red Room at the end of Season 2 happens in an episode called Beyond Life and Death. This is clearly a catabasis experience. And interestingly, Kingsley's work repeatedly refers to a hissing sound, which was related to journeys in the underworld. And this sound seems quite similar to the sound that the evolution of the arm makes. The mare was also related to catabasis journeys. The famous white horse we see throughout the series is likely an allusion to the nightmare. The term nightmare has a few interrelated meanings, and I'd guess Frost and Lynch used the image of a white mare to invoke some of these. In ancient Greece, many people would visit temples for the god Asclepius. After certain rituals, they would lay down in a practice called incubation. The idea was that Asclepius would heal them in altered states of consciousness, such as dreams and visions. The Asclepius tradition is still said to subtly influence the field of medicine. These temples were often decorated with depictions of limbs that were healed by Asclepius, including disembodied arms. According to Carl Karenyi, a researcher into the mysteries of Demeter and Persephone, corn played a key role in the rituals at Eleusis. It is known that corn was displayed during important moments in the ritual practices. Cream corn plays a role within Twin Peaks as well. In an episode introduction written by Lynch, the Log Lady asks us to ponder the symbolic meaning of cream corn. I'll touch on that again in the final section. Kingsley argues that the goddess Nestis was another name for Persephone. He argues that she was a water goddess and was described by a philosopher as moistening the springs of mortals with her tears. One thing that struck me when watching Twin Peaks are these scenes of melodramatic crying. They can be both sad and funny at the same time. One explanation for these crying scenes is the idea that Twin Peaks was lampooning soap operas of the day. Another, more esoteric way to look at it is that these tears have their origin in Persephone's own tears, which express themselves through human beings since we all share in her world soul. I think this may be why Lynch chooses to show this unknown student crying in the first episode of both the original series and The Return. And an even better example is a scene in Season 2 that takes place at the Roadhouse. There is a musical performance going on, and the vibes are good. Then, as Maddie, a Laura Palmer double, is being murdered, our characters begin to mourn, not knowing exactly why. The old waiter, the self in disguise, as Zeus liked to do sometimes, comes over to Cooper and shares words of sympathy. I believe the melodramatic tears we see in Twin Peaks are both for Laura as a person and also for Laura as representative of the world's soul. They are Persephone's tears. This idea correlates with an ancient Gnostic image of the all-watery substance being the tears shed by the goddess Sophia. The way I see it, by attempting to save Laura in the flesh, Cooper prevented the suffering and abused Laura Palmer from her divine conversion, ripping her out of the underworld, trapping her into a new nightmare in some obscure, violent misery, living in Odessa, Texas. Odessa is a word that originates from ancient Greece, and it means wrathful. And speaking of wrathful, if Laura Palmer is Persephone, then that makes Sarah Palmer Demeter. And, like Demeter, Sarah's initial grief at the loss of her daughter turns into misery, then wrath. Eventually, Sarah becomes a dark, murderous creature. Some traditions consider Demeter a dark, age-old goddess, and others called her the Black One. Some priests of Demeter wore masks representing her, and it was, quote, far from a friendly face, more like some ghastly apparition. Sarah Palmer was shown in childhood, adulthood, and older age. This brings to mind the triple form goddess, maiden, mother, crone. She is found in the influential and controversial writings of Robert Graves, and she is honored in modern neo-pagan traditions. Goddess figures from many cultures throughout history have been related to the moon in some way. Just as the moon has phases and seems to take on a different form in the night sky, so does the divine feminine. In the scene where Sarah Palmer murders a man, you see imagery fusing Demeter, Persephone, and Hecate. The feminine goddess all-nature also possesses cunning, cruelty, wickedness, unfathomable depths of passion, and the uncanny gloom of death, the smell of corpses, and putrefaction in equal measure with the potentiality of new life and rebirth. Demeter plays a key role in the tale of an ancient king. This insolent king chopped down the sacred grove of the goddess Demeter in order to build himself a feast hall. He refused to honor the goddess. As punishment for the crime, the goddess inflicted him with insatiable hunger, driving him to exhaust his riches and finally, in abject poverty, devour his own flesh. The hunger that Demeter inflicted on the king was a grotesque, female demon-like creature acting on her behalf. It's probably not a coincidence that similar imagery was used in The Return. The king is a metaphor for our present-day culture. This arrogant king had no respect for the sacred divine feminine. This tale shares a similarity with the realm of hungry ghosts written about in some Tibetan Buddhist traditions. This is a metaphor for all of us. In a futile way, we attempt to fulfill our illusory physical desires in a world that cannot satisfy us. I think The Return is telling us that we've desecrated the divine feminine, our very own world soul. The fact that the real-life owner of the Palmer residence is playing a Chalfant, I believe is Lynch telling us that the insatiable hunger, the wrath of Demeter, the emptiness and plague of our world soul is in our house now. The Return points not only to the idea that Cooper is living in a Bardo state, experiencing worldly life like a dream, but I think it also engages us to ponder whether we are in our own Bardo. Cooper is a stand-in for us. We are the dreamers. Cooper is still sitting in his red room seat, watching the goings-on in the world of Twin Peaks, while we sit in our seats, watching Cooper watch Twin Peaks. Both of our worlds are drained of soul, and we're all hungry ghosts, suffering from insatiable hunger, devouring ourselves and the world, until there will be nothing left. The Return presents us with an alternative to this grim state of affairs, and we'll cover this in part 3. Thanks for watching.